So in this video, I want to go through some practical palette setup advice, things that I do, and how that relates to mixing color and its relationship to painting. Okay, so the first thing that I want you to understand is that the way that I'm using a large palette so that I can hold it and mix on my palette as normal, like holding my palette like this. But I'll also put my palette I've just made up a stand so it can be beside my canvas if I need to. This is a fairly traditional color wheel, just hue around the outside, so the redness, yellowness, greenness around the outside, and then the chroma, or the strength of the color going into reducing towards a neutral across the complementaries. And I've added here a range of tones. Okay, so we have hue, value, chroma, right? So the value is shifted as well in these. So it's giving us a fairly full range of sort of colors at the limit of what the printer could do, but this gives us an idea that we're going to refer back to. So on my palette, I have my pigments arranged by hue. So I'm starting with yellows, orange, red, purple, blue, okay, and going into green. Now, the majority of painting, if you can point over towards here actually, the majority of sort of fairly traditional painting, unless you're doing something really psychedelic, is going to be relatively neutral. So the majority of my painting involves earth colors. Okay, so if you come back over here, most of the colors that I've got on my palette, the bulk of them, are just earth colors, and they have a few advantages. They're light fast, so they're not going to fade. They are cheap, okay? They're series 1 kind of colors, so you're not paying a lot for them. And basically, the majority of my the colors that I'm using are going to be from this middle section. So they're going to be either like they're going to be relatively grayed down, and they're just shifting around in this kind of middle section. I'm not tending to use a lot of very high chroma colors in my painting. And when I'm moving my colors, what I'm basically doing is I'm starting off with a color and then I'm pushing it in a certain direction using some other pigment. Now often an earth color such as these ones is strong enough to move my color in whatever direction that I need to go. If I've got a color that's over here and I need it to be a little bit redder, if I use an earth color like Carpet Mortem, which is a dull red, it will pull me in that direction. It just won't get me out to a very high chroma color, okay? So that's the sort of logic of it. Sometimes I need to go higher chroma, and that's where I'll add in some other higher pigmented, higher chroma pigments, but I don't have that much of them on my palette. I'm tending to use earth colors. So that's just a very practical thing that works for me. Now, one of the things I'm doing is I'm mixing a tint of a lot of my earth colors, and I find that a very useful thing to have on the palette. So if you want to just come in a bit closer, so here you can see I have Carpet Mortem, and I've got a tint of Carpet Mortem. So I've just added titanium white to this, and that gives us a nice, it's quite different of course, but it just saves time in my mixing. I can just reach for it without having to mix extra colors. Same thing here, this relative purple, or it's a mixture of Carpet Mortem and black, and that's giving me this color in between. When I add white to it, it gives me this nice kind of purplish color. So if you think between these colors here, this tint here, this one, so this is just ivory black plus white, and so that gives us this nice range of colors. So at the moment, I don't have a tint for Terra Rosa or Mars Orange, which are the two earth colors that I'm using for my red and orange. And so I'm just going to do that now quickly. So I'm just using some titanium white. Oh, I've got something in my... And what I'm doing here is I'm using a disposable palette for mixing these colors up in larger quantities. Okay, so I am not doing this on my palette beside us here, because it's just, I need a bit more white there. So I'm not doing it on my grey palette here to the side, because that's where I'm really just mixing with a brush. When I'm mixing up larger quantities such as these kind of primaries and secondary pigments, I'm using this disposable palette, and also for larger quantities of paint. So in cases where I need extra paint, I will use, where I know that in my picture I'm going to need a certain main color, then I will mix them on my disposable palette at the side. The other thing that I use the disposable palette for, it's not as good to judge colors off being white, but it's still, you can still do it. It's still usable. But I use it to store my colors at night. So when I finish the day, I use a fair amount of paint, and a lot of the time, or most of the time, there is a certain amount of paint that can be salvaged from the day. And so I can transfer everything from my palette onto the disposable palette, and I just get this is a stationary box, and it will fit my my tear-off palette. So that's something that I do, and I put that in the freezer, and being in the freezer, it slows the rate of the paint oxidizing and going off, and it reduces the oxygen a little bit as well, but it just, primarily because it's cold, it doesn't want to set as quickly. So that's something that allows you to reuse paint from one day to the next, and you can salvage whatever you need. Okay, so now what I wanted to mention was the colors that I'm using, just to give you an idea about what I find useful. This is a Titanate yellow, light fast. It's not a particularly expensive, it's Series 2 from Langridge. Yellow ochre, Naples yellow. That's a convenient way of putting my neutral yellows down. Mars orange, tint of Mars orange. This is Scarlet Lake. So as a non-toxic, so I like to use non-toxic colors, because that way I can use sandpaper and rub things back, and I'm not worried about creating dust that is going to poison me or someone else in the house. So I do use cadmium colors and lead white sometimes, but I try to minimize them. I don't need them most of the time, so I tend not to use them. Carpet mortem and tint of carpet mortem. Here I have a permanent mauve, which is that's one of my few higher, more expensive colors, but it's a permanent purple, so that's a useful one. I also do use dioxazine purple or Windsor purple, but I do prefer these very permanent ones. This is my relative within my spectrum, my relative purple, which is the mixture of carpet mortem and ivory black, and that gives me this lovely neutral purple here that I can work with. And then ivory black plus white, ultramarine. I do like to use Payne's Grey sometimes. It's just because it's convenient. Payne's Grey is a mixture of the ultramarine blue and ivory black pigment. It creates a nice bluish grey, therefore. Prussian blue, which is my cool blue, and so that's a nice blue to give me a coolish blue versus a yellowish blue. If we move around the circle, if we're thinking a blue that's more towards this side of the color wheel versus ultramarine blue, which is more in the purple range of the color wheel. So if I mix some white with ultramarine blue, that's going to give me a much more purplish or reddish blue. So as well. So you can see how much this one is a much more what people commonly call a warm blue, which just means a reddish blue. That's just the term that people tend to use. It's a warm, a purplish blue, so more towards the red side, and this cooler blue is more towards the green or the yellow side. So that's my primary palette setup. Now, if you want to come around here with the camera, and I will just show quickly what I'm doing. I have, for my brushes, this is a convenient way of storing your brushes, and it's good for your brushes as well. So what I tend to do is I'm using this is like a cheap roller tray. It's been tilted up, just got a couple of blocks of wood underneath it, and it's just held in place. And then I'm just using, this is hardware store pure linseed oil. So it's just raw linseed oil. It doesn't need to be an expensive art store brand. It's just something to put your brushes in. And it tends to, if you keep washing your brushes every time you use them, it can be quite hard on your brushes. This way they sort of get conditioned by being in the oil. So it's actually quite a good thing for them. So then I just get them out of there, give them a good wipe off. Okay. If I'm using medium, these days I'm tending to use this Gamblin product, which is a solvent-free fluid. Okay, and it's just because I have become sensitive to terps, so I try not to have that in the studio where I'm breathing it all the time. I still use it sometimes to wash things, but I tend not to use it more than I have to. So I like to use this one, this solvent-free medium. Most of the time, I'm trying not to add too much solvent to my paint, so I tend to use just straight paint, which is a pretty good sort of default to go back to, because it will tend to make your paint nice and solid amounts of paint, rather than being too thin, I find. Okay, so I just want to say one final thing, if we can come back over onto here. So I'll use my palette in one of two ways. Either it can sit like this on the side here. If I'm using larger quantities of paint, so I've got a certain color that I'm using a lot of, I might have it mixed up on here. That can be convenient, but I will either be maybe mixing it on here, so I might be, starting off with a color like this, a relatively neutral sort of color. Usually, that's what I'm going to be moving, and I'll start with a color like this, which is on the orange or the reddish sort of side down here. It's probably a color sort of somewhere like this, something like this, maybe a little bit more towards that side. So that I start there and I say, okay, which way do I need to make this? I'll test it on my canvas, and then maybe I say, okay, it needs to be more towards the red side. Okay, so how would I go from this color? Do you want to just come in a little closer? If I wanted to get more towards this kind of color, then I would choose from somewhere in my red section. I would add maybe a bit more of this, and that's going to move me towards the reds that little bit more. Okay, so I can go down here and I can say, okay, there's a mixture which is a bit redder, right? But you can see on there, when I've added this, it's a little too neutral still. Okay, so I might not have gotten quite strong enough. That's where I was moving towards. Okay, so maybe I add a little bit more here. I'm adding a little bit more white. Still too neutral. Okay, still too neutral. If I needed to go more, give myself higher chroma, I'm going for my higher chroma red to push myself in that direction. Add enough of that, that's going to get me out towards the kind of color that I need. So now that matches a lot better. It's not perfect, but you get the idea of what I'm doing. If I, on the other hand, started here and I wanted to go and I wanted to go more towards a color that was over here. If I choose any of the colors from around here, I'm going to be moving myself more in that direction. Or if I choose, I mean, maybe if I was wanting a color right here, I wouldn't modify this color. I'd just start mixing a new color. If I'm here, if I'm going towards here and I've got this color, I might modify it. So I might add some yellow, right? I might add this in and start pulling myself in this kind of direction by adding a bit more of the yellow. But it's also moving in this kind of direction. If I'm going in this sort of direction, I'm adding yellow, which is pulling me this way. But you see, I might have added, if I just add the yellow, it's probably going to pull me over this way. And I'm probably going to end up too far this direction. So in other words, I really need something to pull me back in that direction now as well. So what do I need? I need a green or a blue to move me a little bit more in that way. So there's different things that I could use, but because I'm wanting to, rather than go straight this way, I want to go a bit more this way. If I just add my relative blue, or in this sort of region, which would be basically ivory black. Ivory black is very close to a neutral in here, or it's perhaps a little on the blue side. So I can add just a little bit of that, and that's just going to kill that yellowness that little bit, which is to say, kill the yellowness is to reduce the chroma and move me towards the middle just that little bit. So if I add this here, that's going to take me from here and move me slightly more in this direction. So looking at that now, the color that I've got there perhaps is still a little on the, it needs a little bit more yellow now. Okay, and that's more or less how I'm using my palette. I have a range of colors along the hue sort of spectrum, and around here I have a few tints of them, which is just convenient rather than having to reach for the full strength one. They're just reduced in power a little bit and closer to the types of colors that I'm probably going to be using. And then I'm starting with a color that I think is the closest approximation to what I want, and then I'm just navigating color space and moving in certain directions. So I think that just about does it.